everyone. My name is Catherine Gorley, and I'd like to thank you for tuning in today for another episode of the Injury Prevention Academy, a podcast brought to you by DORN Companies, the country's leading wellness-based pain management and injury prevention company. DORN is committed to reducing costs of healthcare and workers' compensation, as well as reducing lost productivity, which has resulted in over $120 million in savings over the last 20 years for our clients. Joining us today is Josh Savit. Josh has worked in the EHS field for the past 10 years, developing new methodologies and technologies for monitoring fatigue and alertness, primarily in the mining industry. Prior to his work in fatigue, Josh partnered in developing the first fully customizable MSHA regulatory compliance management tool. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for joining us in this discussion. I really look forward to learning more about some of the practices and some of the technologies that you're seeing in the mining industry.
It's a pleasure to be here and to be discussing things that I actually believe in and feel very passionate about as well.
Absolutely. Now, what are the most important aspects of safety in the mining industry that you found?
I think the most important aspect is communication, is building an open channel of communication, but also providing tools for that communication and context for that communication. I think over the last 20 years, we've been very fortunate to have the technological advancements that we've seen that have allowed for these pieces to really come into play. But how do we use them? How do we move forward with them? How can they be done in a way that is beneficial to both the operators and the operations is the most important aspect right now.
Right, and obviously that focus on communication doesn't have to be just with mining. It can go into other heavy industries like manufacturing or construction.
I think it goes to any aspect of life, to be honest, because this ability to communicate and affect decision making starts at home. It starts with behaviors that we take day to day, and then we bring these practices to the workplace. And we have to recognize that actions, good or bad, are actions. And we have to move beyond behavior as good behavior and bad behavior and what is the normal behavior.
Okay. And obviously communication and safety really need to go hand in hand, because without that open flow of dialogue, without that open, I guess, openness of communication, especially with management, with supervisors, with workers, if there's a breakdown in that communication, safety ultimately suffers.
Absolutely. It's not just a breakdown, it's ambiguity in it. It's what the expectations are. If it's not clear and it's not defined, then it's not actionable. And when I say actionable, I'm not discussing it from a punitive nature. I'm talking about it that you can't grow from it and you can't learn from it. If you don't identify a behavior as acceptable or unacceptable, then somebody's not going to know what to do when they make the decision. So when you call them out for making a decision that you deemed unacceptable at that time, even though it was never adequately put into place, then it leads to a distrust. And that's the key in any industry, but specifically mining, any heavy construction. We trust the people around us. We trust that we're going to make the right decisions. Our coworkers trust that we're going to make the decisions that are beneficial to everybody, and we have to trust that they're going to make the right decisions.
Right, absolutely. And so many strides have been made to make, say, mining and heavy industry safer for workers. And obviously that includes communication, that includes some of the technologies, like you said, like we're doing today, even over a video conference, but also the use of technology with autonomous vehicles and equipment. Now, what
absolutely
is the future of that technology? Because DORN has implemented a program called Alert Meter that lets companies know when their employees may not be operating at peak efficiency, and it's using a gamified system. So what are those technologies that you're seeing within the mining industry?
So we're seeing similar in the mining industry, and it's kind of two sides when you look at the move to autonomous in mining is a much more dramatic place where you see vehicles driving themselves or vehicles having what Hexagon has, which is called a level 9 intervention or vehicle intervention system that can actually stop propulsion, stop the launch of the vehicle if in that way to completely take control of the vehicle. And that's actually a mandate in some of the mining areas right now. But with Alert Meter and with fatigue in general, that's one aspect of the overall system. So Hexagon announced 3 weeks ago at Mine Expo the partnership with Fatigue Science, which is a biomathematical fatigue system that utilizes a wearable that's taking circadian rhythms and the amount of sleep to do predictive fatigue analytics. So very similar to what Alert Meter does in regards of creating baselines, this is creating baselines as well. So Alert Meter is a psychomotor vigilance test. This is a human performance psychomotor vigilance test in that way. So it's embedded into the system. So this is now a second pillar into the overall fatigue and distraction offering that Hexagon has. So we have the ability to provide the cameras and the algorithms that look at eye closure, head movement, percentage of eye closure to identify fatigue from a visual point of view in a real-time place that sends a signal through the onboard computer that can trigger an alert to the operators. And we utilize this both in the mining side of things, and we are bringing this into our heavy construction side of the business. And now we can add in the biomathematical fatigue. So we're adding that predictive element. And we're now offering 2 data points, actually multiple data points if you look at all of the data generated. And by adding these data points, you open up more lines of communication and more ability for us to contextualize what we see. And that goes back to what we talked about with communication. Now you've got multiple places to show an operator an operation why. If you don't answer the why, then everything else is not viable with safety in that way. Why did we pull the truck over? Because we see you falling asleep, and in conjunction with the fatigue science, what they call the ready analytics, we can tell that you are in a fatigue zone and that your risk is higher than safe for you to be operating the vehicle.
That's really, really interesting, of being able to in real time actually see that.
Yeah.
See that level of fatigue. What other technologies are you seeing kind of come into the forefront, even in the next decade or so?
Are we talking overall safety or fatigue and distraction in general?
I'd say, yeah, I'd say kind of overall.
So what we are working on is we have what's also called a collision avoidance system, a CAS system. So this utilizes peer-to-peer communications and other methodologies to identify a vehicle, and are you too close to that vehicle? Is that vehicle in a trajectory that you could have an incident, where we want to reduce and eliminate metal-to-metal incidents, and specifically with the haul trucks to the light vehicles, which tend to be the most dramatic type of incidents one can have. By having these systems and identifying this, now you have yet more information that aligns and allows the operation and the operators to know what's going on. Anytime you can identify risk and point out that risk is there, allows you to quantify it and then reduce that risk by making changes to the operator's behavior or the way the operation is laid out. I mean, you have areas in mines that are inherently dangerous, so you have to be more vigilant. So your actions on the straight path of the haul road are different than your actions in an intersection. So what is acceptable in one spot may not be acceptable in the other. But if you can show and communicate in ways that we hadn't necessarily before. When we talk about, theoretical, we think this is going to happen. You're always going to have somebody who says, well, but it might not. When you show them a video or you show them a playback of trajectory, then you can say, oh, wow, this really came close. And now we know that the risk is even higher into that way. And that system also works with our personal alert system, which is a wearable for the operator on the ground or in other areas. So now they can understand their proximity to the overall equipment and what their risk may be, and what a haul truck driver who's 3.5 stories up may not see the operator who's down on the ground. So that adds another level of visualization. That's what we currently offer. And by doing that in our methodology, trying to utilize a single source of truth in that way to offer, one GPS location, one timestamp, adds a much better overall understanding of the risk. Now, the future, boy, there's some really amazing things happening in that way. I mean, we ourselves are working towards our autonomous overall system. As I mentioned, we have the vehicle intervention system, but we are working towards full autonomy. That will include smart cameras that can do 360 views, object detection, potentially even other types of interventions into that way. It all depends on what technology allows us to do. But today we can put together 5-6 cameras on a vehicle and show you a 360 bird's eye view. And how we make that usable, that's where we are going to as well.
Right. And I think several months ago, there was an article in the BBC that really talked about the rise and hopeful implementation of autonomous vehicles, usually with supply chain, with shipping. And they talked about some of the risks involved, obviously, whether or not there's someone in the cab, even though it's a self-driving, vehicle. Is that the kind of risks kind of back and forth that you're seeing with that rise in autonomous vehicles? Or is it really just a shift in focus or overall safety?
I think it's a shift in overall safety. I'm not an expert on autonomy, and I understand where we're going. Mm-hmm. I look at it more from the operators who are afraid of autonomy, and who fear that their jobs are going to be replaced, mm-hmm. and who also are distrustful of technology in that way. Because we've seen technology fail in that way. That doesn't mean that we're failing now. It means we have experience with that. And the outliers are always identified in a much higher manner. You have 1 million hours of self-driving vehicle tests running, and then you have one incident. It eliminates the 1 million hours of all those tests.
Right.
And I think when you start to give them, again, the tools and the explanation and show how it all works together, and whether you go to full autonomy or semi-autonomous, what we're seeing is a rise in remote mining, especially for the underground world, yes. where the mining is done in a control room. The mining is done by an operator, but they are using, remote systems and working in that manner. And these operators are still working in the same shifts. They're still working in the same manner, but they are, several thousand miles away from the area that they're actually working.
And ultimately much safer for them while still being able to do the same job.
Absolutely. Different types of risks, boredom sets in. If you're not on a vehicle and you're not having the turns and the twists and the bumps and all of that, then boredom can set in, fatigue and distraction set in. Decision making is still an important piece, and you still need that collision avoidance. You still need that proximity to know what the equipment is next to the other piece of equipment. And there are still human beings in there too that the operators have to be aware of. So right. It's not devoid of risk. It's a different kind of risk. And again, understanding and communicating what the risk factors are and the ability to quantify and visualize those risks are very important.
Right. It keeps reminding me, honestly, of the Industrial Revolution, about, 100 years ago, where we started finding, hey, you know what, we could do this so much more safely if we did this. This is how you streamline this process. This is how you actually make it safer for everyone involved, and the slight hesitation that comes with that, but ultimately it completely transforms the way people are able to work in different environments.
Absolutely. And, one of the issues, that I find from the behavior side and the communication side of it is that the Industrial Revolution was a slow turn. We
Yes.
have had a technological revolution over the last 20 years that moved us from letters and just the thought of communicating via international phone call to a computer more powerful than what landed on the moon in your pocket, and the ability to have a face-to-face conversation
like we're doing right
with
now.
someone like we're doing right now.
Yeah.
But that speed in which it happens also has an impact on how people perceive things. And that is one of the factors that we have to look at, that you have some generations of miners who have been on the mine before there was a windshield in their vehicle. There are still guys that remember, driving vehicles without windscreens in them.
Or
having
even
to wear a
without
seatbelt.
with seatbelts. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And so how do you take somebody from the landline, the giant cord that we had, that most of us were excited about when we had a phone in our kitchen that had the really long cord that you could walk away from your family to have the call to.
Right. And then you finally had to undo the cord as you went to go put it back.
Exactly. So they're having to adjust. We have to adjust. The ability to communicate to adjust is. I think, in that, I remember I was in a conference about 3 years ago, and a gentleman came up to me and he said, I have this issue where, I came down, he ran a press factory, and he said, I walked down to the floor and one of the new guys that we hired had his cell phone wedged into the machine. He was watching YouTube videos. And I said, what do I do about this? And I said, well, in your standard operating procedure, do you have a cell phone policy? Well, that's common sense. I shouldn't need to tell somebody not to be watching. And I'm like, it's common sense for you. That generation, it's not common sense. That generation communicates differently. That generation operates differently. So I think it goes both ways, from a communications point of view. And the technology can be used to aid both sides of that.
Right. And even the approach to, I know you have what you call your ecosystem of the correlation of fatigue and distraction at work, whether it's a cell phone, whether it is fatigue, whether it's too many things at once going on and you're not truly focusing in on the project at hand. So really walk us through that process, and maybe how other companies can use that same approach with their employees.
Right, and we look at that not just from fatigue and distraction, but safety altogether. Hexagon is a technology company, but we understand that technology is only a piece of the puzzle. And the original idea of the technology, it starts with the operator. It starts with their individual lifestyle. Now, we're not saying that you mandate or dictate how the lifestyle is. You educate to what the lifestyle is. You educate to how their diet can be affected. And even somebody who works a day shift versus the night shift should have different dietary requirements at that time. You talk about and make it acceptable to discuss mental wellness. because that's an issue that everybody deals with, but it's a key factor into regenerative sleep. It's a key factor into decision making. The way that the brain works is very much, based off of that aspect. Then you have the strong company policies that are both defined, but also non-punitive where they need to be non-punitive. Specifically with fatigue and distraction, these are natural things that happen. Now, fatigue can be brought into 4 different aspects, and you can have a medical issue, you could have emotional, you could have, sleepiness, which is really just not getting regenerative sleep. So, our system has identified operators who have had medical issues, who have had sleep apnea, hypertension, because the chronic fatigue and the chronic lines of critical events that we can see, indicate that this person needs help. And with a non-punitive system, these people their lives are better.
Right.
And then that leads to where the technology fits in, where you have predictive solutions, you have reactive solutions, you have real-time solutions, and understanding that these solutions create points for operators, points for supervisory roles, and then points for leadership and management. And they're different consumers with looking at different aspects of this. But it's all cyclical. And that's why it's an ecosystem. It's not a linear process. It flows back into each other.
Okay. And obviously, like we've said before, that communication flowing back and forth between supervisors and regular workers out on a floor, out in the field is so important, because you actually, when you have that safety communication in place, it really empowers employees to be able to take charge of their own personal safety.
Absolutely. I mean, this is not just for mining. I mean, it's very critical in mining, heavy construction, maritime, aviation. They all have methodologies behind this. Mm-hmm. And that communication loop with defined parameters in each area is really what drives it. And building that trust where an operator can self-report and say, my 5-year-old was not feeling very well and had a rough day at school, and I was up with her for X amount of hours and I didn't get a good night's sleep. And I'm not fearing my position. I'm trusting that my folks and my team and my managers will understand and not coddle me. And that's that's a misconception of a lot of people. These people aren't asking to be coddled. They're asking, hey, keep track of me. I know I'm at a higher risk. Ping me every hour or two and make sure I'm okay. Let's have a check-in,
Right. And I think that can also, and I think that can also be brought into, like you said, with the mental health aspect. It's so important in fatigue, but it's also kind of checking in with your employees every once in a while and saying, hey, how are things going, overall? How can we improve? But how do you feel you can improve as well? It's having those discussions.
Yeah. And trusting that those discussions are going to be non-punitive, and that the operator is not going to be pulled aside and sent home without pay,
Right.
If it has to happen because they're an absolute risk or they violated a policy, then it has to happen.
Right. And that's that aspect of, that kind of like what you said, that baseline of safety, mm-hmm. But it's also empowering people to make those best decisions for the safety of overall, if that happens to come up. Yeah. Absolutely. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
I was actually just going to mention that Hexagon was awarded the safety award for the 2020 Mining Technology Excellence Awards, and which is absolutely amazing. That's so great. How did Hexagon update their safety and risk management programs during COVID? I mean, how did that approach shift?
I think we were already in the process of that anyways, and that stems from our OAS light vehicle system.
Okay.
And the fact that we recognized that the risks were there, not just for the haul trucks, but for the light vehicle systems overall, and the need to address that. So we had been working on a smaller version, a more compact version that could work for buses, vans, the pickup trucks, utes, buckies, depending on what area you live in. I always have to think about what region I'm talking about when I talk about pickup trucks, because they're called different things in different continents. Yes. You know, and by showing that fatigue and distraction is a overall site-wide issue, and taking it just out of the haul trucks and putting it into everything really allowed us to help with, again, the adoption of those systems. To say your supervisor is just as susceptible to having a fatigue and distraction event as the haul truck driver is. They're going to be different. There are going to be different parameters, and we understood that, and we knew that, and the requirements have to be different, and the training has to be different. Mm-hmm. But we understood that, you know. And so I think that was a key driver to say that there is a need to bring that technology to the mine. And that is also part of the integration and partnership with Fatigue Science, because the predictive fatigue analytics that Fatigue Science offers allows us to look at the entire operation, not just the operators. So mechanics, engineers, you know, different groups of people who are on the mine site, who are working on the vehicles, who are involved in the day-to-day activities that inherently add more risk to it or are at risk, also need to be vigilant. They also need to be understanding of that. So by having those systems in place, I think that's where we are now a all-encompassing offering, from the haul truck drivers all the way down to the janitors, if the site wants to believe that that's necessary. Which, to me, you know, you're dealing with chemicals. If you make a mistake and you pour the wrong chemicals while you're cleaning the floor, that can lead to problems. So there's nobody who's not susceptible, and there's no risk that isn't viable on that.
Right, and having companies understand that overall picture of their safety programs is so important, obviously. And I know that a lot of different, kind of like what I mentioned during this past year, a lot of that shifted. A lot of that, I think, came into more of a focus, because with this past year, I think different companies saw now those areas of improvement that they needed to focus on.
So they did, for sure.
Yeah. How?
No, go ahead, please.
I was just thinking of how different companies can update even further some of their own policies to really hone in on those high risk, just last minute situations, which, you know, only so much can be done up until a point. However, it's making sure that you're set up to make those decisions.
Again, it's the understanding of what those situations are. I mean, that's the first key factor. One of the things that I took notice of during the pandemic with some of the folks that I worked with was they shut down the buses, because you couldn't have, you know, 75 people in a bus.
Right.
So you now had operators, some of them driving 2 hours to site, working a 12-hour shift, and driving 2 hours home. That's a 16-hour day. So the opportunity for regenerative sleep is much lower. So do you have to build in other breaks? Do you have to build in other pieces into that? And that was a key piece that I saw more and more as I talked to more operations about what was going on. You know, one of the upsides, and Hexagon was well positioned for this because of the way that we view our technology. We had already, based on client feedback before the pandemic, were working on redoing our visual algorithm to do fatigue while somebody was wearing a respirator or a dust mask, because some operators do that.
Yes.
So the OAS system is capable of being, just as viable if the operator's face is obstructed, or if you can see their mouth and nose, or they're wearing a respirator or a dust mask. And as people implemented mask policies in the vehicles and things like that, there was not a disruption to our system. We were positioned for that. But that again opens lines for communication, and it opens lines for those pieces. So, I myself worked remotely for a year. We only came back to the office in June of this year, really.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was well positioned. I had worked I had a home office since 2003, actually. So, just going back home was easy, but, it disrupts everything, where you don't see it disrupting everything. Not everybody was set up for a home office. Not everybody has that. And when you take some of the support staff and you put them at home, or you furlough them, and you're running a mine at a low staff number,
mm-hmm.
that has other effects. You're relying on other folks. You're relying on not having the same quality of food or the same amount of bottles of water, where you had these disruptions. These are all play into those factors of there. Change is change, and when change happens, it is disruptive, no matter if it's good change or bad change. And that's what I mentioned earlier. Behavior is behavior. If somebody's behavior is good and it turns bad, we notice it. If somebody's behavior is bad and it becomes good, we tend to applaud it, but we don't recognize it as a change.
Right. And even when different programs even start to implement, or when companies really start to implement safety programs, the stress in the workplace can actually decrease by as much as 80%. And seeing even just the stress being taken away from certain aspects of your job, which, I mean, we all have various stressors throughout the day, but in terms of overall stress, if you can implement that safety program, if you can implement that open communication, you're going to see that drastic difference.
Absolutely. And again, having the right tools in place, because quantifying things without the tools, without the appropriate items, becomes difficult. And especially with fatigue and distraction, it's a multi-phase process. So as intrusive as somebody might think a camera in the vehicle might be, to have a camera looking at you and showing you that you're falling asleep is tool number one in that process. To have a camera facing forward and showing you just the amount of misdirection that you're taking during that 2-second eye closure is data point number two that really helps identify what the risk is and what the impact could be. Add in predictive fatigue analytics that we now have. Now you've got data point number three, and those changes that we need to implement and those rationales behind it are much easier and a much slower process, and not a slower process, but a more defined process. And I think that is one of the most effective pieces of safety management, is knowing what each output should be and clearly identifying that output, and then giving them the tools to use that output. And that's that stage right there from, even from a simple risk assessment. Why are we doing a risk assessment? Why are we implementing the technology? Why are we implementing this technology? Here's your output of that. And being willing to say, do you realize this risk? And is this risk acceptable? And that is a key factor. Some risk has to be taken in any, mining, construction. There is risk that's taken. And let's be honest, the world is built on people taking risks.
Yes.
Can we give them the opportunity to take those risks in the safest possible way and make sure that they get home to their families every day? That's our job.
Right, absolutely. And DORN has had this almost saying of data drives direction. You know, you want to be able to take all of the information at your disposal and make those rational, clear steps for the growth of the business, but also the safety of your employees and finding the best way forward.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we as safety professionals have a responsibility, and we are responsible for ensuring that the decisions that the operators and the workers in any format are being asked to make are driven by what's right and what's wrong, and not being driven by what's profitable and what's not profitable.
Right.
And that ability to give them the tools to make the decisions, not to forego the profitability, not to forego the task at hand, because that is the task at hand. You know, especially in mining, we're in an extraction industry. You have to dig to earn in that way. It's okay. We can do this. This is an acceptable, you know, level of risk that we have, and I'm perfectly willing to say this risk is not acceptable at this point, and can we rethink the process? Not I won't do it. Can we rethink the process?
Right, absolutely. And that can be applied to, like you said, any of those really hands-on industries like construction, like manufacturing. It's finding those risks and finding that best way forward.
Right. It's that wonderful balance that we all do every day of what is best for everything around us.
Yes. Yes.
You know, we all want to get into, most of us want to get to our destinations as fast as possible, but we know that we shouldn't go 82 miles an hour, you know, in a residential zone. It's probably not the right thing to do.
Probably not. Probably not.
Yeah.
Thank you, Josh, so much for joining me today and really giving your insight in the safety aspects that you're seeing in the mining industry, the communication that safety programs truly need to have, just to make sure that everyone stays as safe as possible, but also figuring out how we can move forward and how we can use the technologies available to us to do our jobs more efficiently and more productively.
That was my pleasure, and it's a privilege to be a part of it. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you all for joining DORN's Injury Prevention Academy. Tune in next time to learn more about the innovative steps and the programs taking place in today's world of safety.